Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend. Please join us in episode 4 as we discuss the importance of structure, what it is, and how to implement it in your home with your dog. I think we've spent a lot of time on the mental. Let's talk about emotional limits. Okay, now emotional limits is an interesting thing because as humans, we can talk to each other, right? So I can ask my sister or my niece or my nephew, so how do you feel? Like what's on your mind, right? And usually they can go ahead and express to me their thoughts, and they can express to me how they're feeling. Depending on how they're feeling, I'm going to empathize, I'm going to listen to them. But then I'm able to give them emotional feedback. No, you shouldn't think that way. You have to believe in blah, blah, blah. You should, we kind of guide that emotion so that way they don't keep falling into that rut, right? And that's kind of something people do in therapy and counseling, in parenting. All of that gets done, right? And it's easier for us to do as humans because we speak the same language,
Right.
and we can identify what's going on in the dog's body language or in the kid's body language and mental state. But the problem is with dogs, the only way you can actually read their emotional state is by learning to master reading their body language, right? We tend to see like the reactions of dogs. So we know the dog is upset when he's lunging and growling, but we don't necessarily see the preemptive things that happen before that, right? And so the same way, it's our job as humans to give people emotional feedback, like praising them for things that they do well, maybe showing disapproval or disappointment when they're behaving a certain way wrong. Our job is to also provide limits on the way that dogs are allowed to feel about certain things and certain contexts of things, right? And there are ways that we directly can affect emotion, but then there are ways that we indirectly affect emotion. And I've heard Mariano riff on this a lot. Would you be able to kind of elaborate a little bit on that, man?
Yeah. So when we talk about affecting emotion, to me, it's harder to directly affect emotion. I know that you can affect arousal levels, and you
Hmm.
can affect kind of short term things. But the problem with affecting emotion is I'm not I'm not sure that a dog is aware of their emotional state. They know when they're excited. They know how they know that they feel negative about a person, but they're not like introspective enough to be like, maybe I should let this go.
Right.
It's more indirect through the physical work and the mental work. No, don't focus on that guy. Don't bark at the mailman. Go over there, lay down, and relax.
Right.
You can start introducing just peace back into that context. And that's kind of the
Right.
way that, when a dog is emotionally unsure or emotionally ungrounded, they pour all this mental and physical energy into something that's just not necessary. They don't have a sense of perspective, which naturally they wouldn't, and it's our job to go in and kind of teach that sort of thing. So a dog can be interested in something or even be nervous about something, but it's not quite the same thing as just completely losing your cool and all right, that's it. Everything is game over and I'm just going to go for this one objective.
Right. Totally. 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 Um, you said a word that I really liked, the word grounded.
Mhm.
And for people who use this word or know what it means, would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah, so grounded or directed, focused. A dog, a really high energy dog, I think of like Malinois, border collies, shepherds, dogs that are really uppity and highly trainable, but they're also antsy and they have these kind of, these classic issues, I guess, that, to put a word to it, that people tend to struggle with. And the problem is it's not necessarily a matter of trying to take this really high energy dog and lower that energy or lessen it.
Right.
We like that they're high energy. It's just when you put it to something that's functional and serves the dog and serves the owner,
Hmm.
then things get a little better. So, a dog left to their own devices can, I think of like a dog with separation anxiety, just sitting there freaking out, not knowing what to do, chewing on things.
Hmm. Hmm.
But there are ways to ground them and direct them. Here, how about, go do this particular thing? And you do that with limits and, all the other kind of buzzwords we're talking about start to kind of tumble in. I'm limiting
Right.
dogs in order to take away options that aren't good for them. I've known dogs that chew on something they shouldn't, swallow it, and go to the vet. Uh,
Right.
you know, I've had a client whose dog broke the window to try to get outside and follow the car. It's
Yeah.
So those
Yeah.
are limits. If you tell the dog no, a crate in a sense is a limit, but ultimately you're creating a safer space for the dog mentally and physically.
Right.
With
Right.
that, with obedience, they understand what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing. They can manage their arousal via something safer like a Kong toy or just learning how to place and relax, period.
Right.
And
Just
that's
developing that skill as a muscle,
exactly, it's just kind of like a live wire that you plug into something. The
Right.
energy can be there, but just make sure that it's going in a direction that's conducive and that's helpful.
Right. Right. And I want to, I think you bring up a good point, and I think this is something worth talking about right now. Um, the difference between stimulating the mind and grounding the mind.
Yeah.
Right. And I hear this a lot with people who are really trying to get their dog under control. And, you guys work really, really hard. And I actually enjoy clients like this because I'm actually able to tell them the work that you're doing is too much. And if you just focused on certain avenues of what I'm guiding you through, you won't have to work so much. So let me explain this theory, right? A lot of people think, especially young working dogs, German Shepherd pointers, Malinois, as you mentioned before, people think that there's this battery of energy that dogs have, right? And your agenda, they think that your agenda should be every day drain that battery to as close to zero as you possibly can, in fear of that if you don't drain that battery, that leftover energy is going to roll over into the next day.
Right.
Right. And so they feel like, oh man, my dog just chewed up the whole couch. And I think it was because I forgot to walk him this morning. Right. And or they'll say, oh, my dog's acting out today because I forgot to hike him yesterday. Right. And the funny thing is when I asked them, I said, why do you do all this stuff? They're like, well, because I have to keep his brain stimulated. I got to give him something to do, And so when I asked them about the walks, I said, so how are the walks? Like, tell me about how you guys go about your walks. They're like, well, we go for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. And you know what's crazy? Like, he's tired at the end of the walk, but then 20 minutes later, he's like back to normal. And
Mhm.
he's still stimulated, right? And to kind of go back to those positive feedback loops, right? Sniffing and roaming, all that stuff actually amplifies our dogs, and you
Mhm.
guys may not know it. So the reason why a working dog like a German Shorthair Pointer can walk for an hour and a half and track things is because guess what? That's what they were bred to do. Right. And if we don't ground that dog into focusing on something like healing or paying attention or calming themselves down, then unfortunately what ends up happening, the dog actually gets overstimulated. Right. And can be so stimulated. And so a lot of times people will also say, like, I need to stimulate my dog's brain because this is what their dog trainer has recommended for them to do. So they go, you know what? My dog is really aggressive towards other dogs. And they said I need to stimulate his brain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign him up for agility.
Right.
Right. And we all know what happens at agility class when that happens. Right. The dog accidentally might go after a dog at agility class. Right. Because what's happening is this idea that the brain, that there's kind of this scarcity, like there's not enough stimulation that this dog is getting. Right. And the reality of it is the difference between stimulating your dog and grounding your dog is the difference between, signing your kid up for 10 after school programs because he's ADHD, or teaching your kid, emotional and meditative practices to be able to calm his nerves, relax, do things like that. Right. And so don't get me wrong, stimulating your dog is very important. Playing with your dog, walking your dog, exercising your dog is very important. But what we see that it happens excessively, and the grounding of our dogs, which involve the development of structure and discipline and obedience and rules, right? That is ultimately what gets our dogs to chill and calm down and be the loving family member that we want.
Yeah, I want to be super clear. It's not an either or scenario. If you have a dog that's very energetic, yes, exercise them. It's very good for them, but it's not a substitute for grounding, for structure, mental
Right.
structure. And so
Right.
what ends up happening, I just dealt with this the other day, twice actually in one day, is same scenario. Really high energy dog. It was a border collie coonhound mix, super high energy dog.
Mm-hmm.
And they walk him and he's, same thing. He's really sweet. He's this and that, but he lunges and he's going after every cat he sees, goes after every dog behind a fence that tries to bark at him, doesn't like people coming over to the house. Definitely had some issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're like, well, we tried to walk him like 2 miles twice a day. The mom currently isn't working, so they have the time and they're,
Right.
they're really pouring it in. And I try to explain to them, it's good that you do that. And I'm really proud of you for being such a devoted owner. And I'd love to see it.
Right.
But while you don't necessarily need to stop, it's not going to fix your problem.
Right.
All you're doing when you take a dog with these sorts of, kind of quirks to their personality and walk them for that long is you're taking this dog and still keeping his issues and making them worse and giving the dog excellent cardio with which to continue to do these things.
Then the 2 miles turn to 3 miles, turn to 4 miles.
Yeah, the old adage of like, I got a baby tiger and every time he growled at me, I fed him and pretty soon he was giant and now he's growling at me. So
Yeah, right.
so
I like that.
so that's essentially what ends up happening. So yes,
Yeah.
exercise your dog. It's very vital, but it's not a substitute for structure. And I just wanted to clarify
Right.
one quick thing. When you talk about the ADHD kid,
Mhm.
the you say like putting him into, a sport versus meditation. Either one of those is grounding. So
Right.
it's I look at it more as like the kid who can't stop, hitting other kids.
Right.
I- You can, you can put him to a sport and think that maybe he's just overly energetic and stuff like that. And maybe that is some of it. But at the end of the day, no matter how exercised the kid is,
Mhm.
you still have to teach them there is no hitting.
Right. 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 No, that's 100%. I agree with that. So ultimately, what we really want to break down to everybody is that structure is intended to affect the dog's physical behavior, the dog's mental states, and the dog's emotional states, right? And this is ultimately why dog trainers are such huge advocates of structure, because I want you guys to think about confidence. I want you to think about safety and security. And I want you to put yourself in a memory of someone who makes you feel so safe, so secure, who you trust, who you feel so confident about. And I want you guys to really think about that relationship and really just hone into that. And I want you guys to think, why do I love this person? Why do I respect this person? Why does this person make me feel so safe? And I guarantee you it has something to do with the way that the relationship is structured. Okay. Usually people who are inconsistent, we lose trust in. Usually people who, are all over the place, we don't necessarily rely on them for too many things. But the people that you guys love dearly and respect dearly, I want you guys to think about the structure that was in place. And our dog trainer's goal for trying to guide you guys through structure, suggesting structure as a solution for things, is just because we want your dogs to feel safe, secure, love you, and respect you all at the same time.
Mhm,
And
100%.
that's the purpose for this.
And there's
Okay.
byproducts to safety, security. A dog that
Yeah.
feels safe, feels secure is calm and flexible
Hmm.
and,
Hmm.
and reasonable. So there's definitely things that, that they're kind of like structure overall. You
Right.
actively work this, but you're really going for this and the byproduct of it, which is that.
Right. And what ends up happening, you start creating an environment where the dog feels emotionally balanced
Right.
and mentally balanced. Right. And that's ultimately, like, we're all trying to find that in our personal lives. Right. And we can totally do it with our dogs. Um, Awesome. I really liked this podcast. I hope that this podcast was helpful for you guys. I hope it gave you some insight into what dog trainers really mean when we say structure. And for those of you dog trainers who were having difficulty explaining this or describing this to your clients, please listen to this podcast again. We hope it was helpful for you, because this is years and years of just interpreting and breaking down and dissecting things that, I would try and explain structure to a client and then I would fall short and be like, damn it, how
Mhm.
can I explain that better? How can we teach that better? And that, with the help of my mentors and the research that I've done, this is what it comes down to. This is what we've funneled it down to all mean. Um, awesome, man. Anything else you want to say?
No, I mean, you're describing it perfectly. You can kind of tell for any dog trainers listening to this, if you have a hard time describing structure, I know you know the feeling of, you're in the ballpark. You're like saying words that are close-ish to what you're trying to get at. But sometimes it's frustrating when you just know and even sometimes it may still go well and you may still get your point across and they may still want to work with you, which is great.
Mhm.
But you kind of leave and you're like, damn, why couldn't I think of this word to really clearly help get my point across? And that's why it's
Right.
important to, listen to this a couple times. We urge you guys often to write it out and just write it out for your own sake, not necessarily to give to anyone, but sometimes in writing things out, you think of it in a different way and then you reread
Right.
it, and hone it. It's your craft.
Right. And I will suggest the best way to really understand structure is relate it to your life and relate it to a human experience. If you notice through this podcast, me and Mariano, we all have anecdotes that relate to structure from our own personal lives. And I think that's one of the best ways for you to connect with a human being. Telling them a true story, telling them something about structure and how it affected you and how maybe it might relate to their dog's behavior. That's ultimately what I feel is going to really hit the nail right on the head when teaching.
100%.
All right. Awesome, guys. Well, we want to thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Dog Trainers Podcast. Again, this whole podcast was on the idea of developing structure with our dogs. My name is Brent LaBrada, and that is Mariano Alvarez. We're going to go ahead and put our Instagram handles and our emails down here. If you guys are interested in sending us in some questions, please feel free to do so. We're super excited to see what kind of things are on your guys' mind. We'd love to make that the next subject in our next episode of our podcast. We hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
You're speaking dog. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope you guys have a Shraggy. We hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Please, if you guys found that this podcast was useful for you, share it with someone who you think might be able to benefit from it. And thank you guys so much. We'll see you guys later. You guys have a great rest of the day. Take care.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love